Violin students of the Leopold Auer class. Jascha Heifetz. Heifetz was in the Auer class in St. Petersburg, Russia between 1910 and 1917, from the age of 9. He went on to become the greatest violinist since Paganini. He held his teacher Leopold Auer in very high regard. Nathan Milstein. Milstein arrived in the Auer class around 1915 at the age of 11. He was a superb violinist, one of the very best, and had a distinguished recording in performing career. Milstein said, when Auer was sick, he would ask me to come to his home. Isolde Menges. Isolde Menges, born in England in 1893, joined the Auer class in 1909 and continued to attend, in Russia and Europe. Until 1918 when Auer finally emigrated to the US. She became quite well known in the UK and is a superb, and somewhat underrated violinist, who is not well known enough in my opinion. Mischa Elman. Elman joined the Auer class in 1902. Elman was a great player with a wonderful sound. But like so many other fine violinists of the era, he was ultimately eclipsed by the brilliance of Heifetz. Toscha Seidel. Seidel studied with Auer in St. Petersburg, alongside his fellow student violinists Jascha Heifetz, Efrem Zimbalist, Mischa Elman and Nathan Milstein. It is rumored that Auer said of Heifetz and Seidel, "Jascha plays like an angel but Toscha plays like the devil. And so a wickedly brilliant player." Ultimately he worked in Hollywood for the silver screen. As a soloist and concertmaster for Paramount Studios. He was the uncredited violin soloist on the 1939 Hollywood classic musical The Wizard of Oz. Efrem Zimbalist. Zimbalist was born in 1889 and entered the Auer class at age 12. By age 21 he was considered one of the world's greatest violinists. In 1928, Zimbalist began teaching at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. He was its director from 1941 to 1968 and his pupils included such distinguished musicians as Arend Rosen and Oskar Shumsky. Eddy Brown. American violinist Eddy Brown was born in 1895 and joined the Leopold Auer class in Russia up until 1915 when he returned to the US. He was active in concertizing and played on radio. He was a soloist with the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and the Boston Symphony Orchestra. In 1922 he founded the Eddy Brown String Quartet, and in 1932 he became president of the Chamber Music Society of America. Sascha Lasserson. A product of the amazing class of Leopold Auer in St. Petersburg, Sascha Lasserson came to London from Russia in 1914 and stayed on to become, over a period of 60 years, one of the greatest violin teachers in the country. Apparently Heifetz would drop by to see him when he was over in the UK visiting from America. Max Rosen. Max Rosen was a Jewish-American violinist born in 1900 whose parents had emigrated to the USA when he was an infant. He went to the Auer class and returned to the US in 1917. He gave concerts and was married to an opera singer. They divorced in 1930. He lived and taught violin at East 77th Street, New York City. Rosen was a keen chess player. He died in 1956. Thelma Given. Thelma Given made a name for herself as a female soloist during a time when that was exceptional. A child prodigy, she was born in 1896 in Columbus, Ohio, but traveled to Russia as a teenager to study with Leopold Auer. Though Given got caught up in the Russian Revolution, She managed to return to the US for her Carnegie Hall debut in 1918. She played on a 1738 Guarneri violin. Kathleen Parlow. Born in Canada in 1890, the violinist Kathleen Parlow was perhaps the most renowned female violinist at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1906 she went to St. Petersburg where she became a student of the legendary Leopold Auer. Glazunov, the director of the St. Petersburg Conservatory at the time, recommended that she give the Belgian premiere of his violin concerto. Parlow became a great favorite in Norway, where the Norwegian composer Johan Halvorsen dedicated his violin concerto to her. A wealthy Norwegian patron bought her a 1735 Guarneri del Gesù violin that had formerly belonged to Vivaldi. She continued to tour and also made recordings, but decided to retire from touring in 1925 and instead became a teacher in San Francisco. In 1941 she returned to Canada where she remained until her death in 1963. She taught at the Royal Conservatory in Toronto. Cecilia Hansen. Cecilia Hansen, Russian, Cecilia Genrikovna Gonzen, was a Russian violin virtuoso and music teacher. She was born in 1897 in Russia and died in 1989 in London. Her father took her to the St. Petersburg Conservatory to study with Leopold Auer when she was 10. She fled Russia after the revolution and toured Europe and the Far East. In 1925, Sergei Prokofiev dedicated the second of his 5 melodies, Opus 35 bis, to her. She made some recordings for Victor Records. Hansen moved to London with her second husband, where one of her daughters sadly died during a bombing raid in 1940. In 1950, her husband Hermann Friedmann was offered a position teaching philosophy at the University of Heidelberg in West Germany. Cecilia also taught at Heidelberg and was a professor at the Higher School of Music. After her husband passed away, Hansen moved back to London to live with her surviving daughter Tatiana. Hansen died in 1989, in London, where she was also buried. F. Steinway. Not much information is available on F. Steinway. Georges Boulanger. Georges Boulanger, George Pantozzi, was born in Tulcea, Romania, from a Romani gypsy family with a very long tradition in music. He was born in 1893 and died in 1958. As Boulanger was playing Paganini, he was heard by Leopold Auer, who was fascinated by his artistic skills. Boulanger studied with him for the next 2 years. Under the recommendation of Auer, Georges Boulanger received a position of first violinist in the Café Chantant in St. Petersburg, Russia. He went on to perform in Berlin, London and other large European cities, and was signed by German publishing house Boat & Bach, who published his musical compositions. Boulanger lived in Germany from the early 1920s until 1948, when he moved to South America. Lyubov Streicher. Lyubov Lvovna Streicher, born in 1888, was a Russian composer, teacher, and violinist, as well as a founding member of the Society for Jewish Folk Music. She graduated from the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where she studied with Leopold Auer. In 1908, she joined Nessin and Lazare Saminsky as founding members of the Society for Jewish Folk Music in St. Petersburg. Benno Rabinof. Violinist Benno Rabinof was born in 1902 and died in 1975. He was the last of Leopold Auer's famous students and studied with the great teacher after the latter had moved to America. Benno married his pianist wife Sylvia in 1943 and they began concertizing around the world together, performing violin and piano sonatas, as well as appearing in solo recitals and as soloists with major orchestras. Throughout their career Benno and Sylvia maintained a busy performing and teaching schedule and also made recordings. Julia Klumpke. Julia Klumpke was born in 1870. She was an American concert violinist and composer who studied with Auer in America in the 1920s. In 1928, she went on a world tour. In the mid-1930s, Klumpke returned to live in San Francisco, where she was a member of several musical associations, including the Women Musicians Club and the Women's City Club, both of San Francisco, the California Composers Society, and the Music Teachers Association of California. Klumpke, who also studied composition with Nadine Boulanger, composed over 4 dozen pieces of music, mainly chamber music, psalms, and choral music. Klumpke died in San Francisco in 1961. Sylvia Lent. Sylvia Lent was born in 1903 in Washington, D.C. The daughter of composer and cellist Ernest Lent and pianist Mamie, Simons Lent. She studied in Chicago with Leopold Auer. Sylvia Lent made her debut concert tour in Germany, playing in Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig and Munich in 1922. Her New York debut followed in March 1923. By age 23 she had been featured as a soloist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, the State Symphony Orchestra of New York, and the New York Symphony Orchestra. She made one recording for the Victor Talking Machine Company, in 1924. She married and had 2 children. Lent died in 1972. Margarita Mandelstam. Russian Jewish violinist Margarita Mandelstam, later known as Margarita Selinsky, was born in 1895 in Riga. She studied at the St. Petersburg Conservatory with Leopold Auer. Mandelstam was based in the United States after 1921. She performed with her American husband, Max Selinsky, a fellow musician. The Selinskys gave their first American recital at New York's Aeolian Hall and toured North America playing violin duets through the 1920s and 1930s. In 1940 they performed with their pianist daughter, and were known as the Selinsky Trio. Their son was an artist. Margarita Selinsky died in 1962 in Los Angeles. Myron Polyakin. Myron Borisovich Polyakin was born in 1895 in Cherkasy. He was a Russian Empire and Soviet violinist and pedagogue, one of the many disciples of the famous Leopold Auer. Between 1917 to 1926 he toured many countries of the world, and in 1922 gave his New York debut. Upon his return to the Soviet Union, he undertook the professorship position at the Leningrad Conservatory, 1928 to 1936, and then the Moscow Conservatory, 1936 to 1941. He died in 1941 in Moscow. Kemp Stillings. Violinist Kemp Stillings was born in 1888 in Massachusetts. She went to Berlin to study with Joseph Joachim, and to St. Petersburg for further studies with Leopold Auer. Stillings performed in Russia and Finland before World War I. She played with pianist Francis Nash in 1917 and 1918, in New York and several other American cities, and was a guest soloist with the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra and the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra. She toured in South America in 1920. Stillings became suddenly blind in the 1920s, and after that focused on teaching. It has been a handicap, but also a blessing, she told an interviewer in 1940. It has made my critical hearing ever so much more acute. Besides, something like this makes us so human. Ruth Ray. American violinist and teacher Ruth Ray was born into a farming family in Danville, Illinois in 1897. Ruth Ray's family moved to Chicago a few months after her birth. Her mother, a pianist who always wanted to play the violin, had her learning to play before age 4. In 1914 Ray traveled to study under Leopold Auer. Her contemporaries and lifelong friends at St. Petersburg were violinists Jascha Heifetz and Toscha Seidel. Her time with Auer was cut short when World War I began. She returned to Chicago and later took lessons in New York. In November 1919, Ray made her Carnegie Hall debut, and she later appeared with the New York Philharmonic. In 1927 she spent a season as the concertmaster of the Chicago Women's Symphony. She died in 1999. Mishel Piastro. Mishel Piastro was a classical violinist and conductor. He was born in 1891 in Kerch, Russia, based in the United States since 1920. And died in 1970 in New York City. He played in the San Francisco Symphony from 1925 to 1930. And the New York Philharmonic from 1931 to 1943. He was also the conductor of the Longin Symphonette. Apparently he was the favorite pupil of Leopold Auer. He attended the St. Petersburg Conservatory from 1903 to 1910. In 1908, in honor of Auer's 40 years as a teacher, the conservatory founded a competition in his name, which was finally realized in 1911, financed by the Tsar and friends of the conservatory. The winner in 1911 was Mishel Piastro. Francis Macmillan. American violinist Francis Macmillan, born in 1885, was a pupil of Leopold Auer. By the age of 21 he had obtained worldwide recognition. He died in 1973. Oskar Shumsky. Oskar Shumsky was an American violinist and conductor. He was a pupil of Leopold Auer from 1925 and studied at the Curtis Institute of Music from 1928 to 1936, continuing his studies with former Auer student Efrem Zimbalist, after Auer's death in 1930. His New York debut was in 1934 and his Vienna debut was in 1936. He played first violin in the Primrose Quartet from 1939, and the same year joined the NBC Symphony Orchestra under Arturo Toscanini. He taught at the Curtis Institute, Philadelphia, Peabody Conservatory Baltimore, Yale University, and, from 1953, the Juilliard School in New York. From 1959 to 1967, he co-directed the Stratford Festival, in Ontario, with Glenn Gould. He made recordings and gave concerts, again in 1981 after a 30-year hiatus. Many fellow violinists consider him to be one of the great violinists of the 20th century. He died in 2000. Joseph Akron. Violinist-composer Joseph Akron was born in 1886 and between 1899 and 1904 he studied violin under Leopold Auer and composition under Anatoly Lyubov, at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. He is a famous composer for violin and also composed Hollywood film scores. He died in 1943 in America. Joseph Borisov. Joseph Borisov was born in 1890 in Kerch, Crimea. In 1902 to 1909 he studied with Leopold Auer in St. Petersburg. He embarked on a world tour and then settled in the U.S. in 1920. Borisov worked at the Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra and also conducted concerts for children in Hollywood. He wrote the Crimean Rhapsody for violin and piano. He was also known as a landscape painter. From 1941, he was conductor of the radio orchestra Longin Symphonette, and also played with the San Francisco Orchestra and the New York Philharmonic. Raphael Bronstein. Raphael Bronstein, born in 1896, was a Lithuanian-born American violinist and violin professor. Bronstein studied violin with Leopold Auer at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. He arrived in the United States in 1923 to take a job as an assistant to Auer. Bronstein's teaching career spanned 65 years. He taught at the Hart School in Hartford, Boston University, Manhattan School of Music, Queens College, City University of New York, and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Samuel Dushkin. Samuel Dushkin was a Jewish-American violinist born in Poland in 1891. He studied with Leopold Auer in New York City. Dushkin collaborated closely with Igor Stravinsky in the composition of the latter's violin concerto, and performed its premiere. Dushkin also gave the premiere of Ravel's orchestral version of his Tsigan, in Amsterdam on October 19, 1924. Dushkin published many arrangements and transcriptions for violin and piano. He died in New York in 1976. Illya Malkin. Illya Malkin was a former pupil of the great Hungarian teacher, Leopold Auer. Malkin was also an early teacher of Jascha Heifetz. Ioannes Nalbandyan. Nalbandyan was born in 1871. A pupil of Auer and later his assistant in the St. Petersburg Conservatory, he also taught Jascha Heifetz and Mischa Elman. He remained in Russia. George Perlman. Perlman was born in 1897, in the Ukraine, where generations of his family had been rabbis. He was 4 when his parents immigrated to Chicago. He also studied for a year with the great Leopold Auer. In 1933 he became associate violin editor for the Carl Fischer Music Publishing Company in New York, a position he held for many years. Perlman's original music is published by Fischer, Boosey and Hawkes, and Theodore Presser. Many of Perlman's pieces reflect his Jewish heritage. In addition to the Suite Hebraïque, written in 1929, there are also the Ghetto Sketches of 1931 and the Israeli Concertino of 1973. Perlman taught countless students over the course of his career. He was married and had a daughter, and died in 2000 at 103 years of age. He had only retired from teaching in April of that year. He passed away in June. Mischa Weisbord. Mischa Weisbord, 1907–1991, was a Jewish-Russian violinist who was highly successful in the first decades of the 20th century and was named by his admirers the new Paganini. His father Alexander sent him to study in St. Petersburg with the violinist Leopold Auer. The year 1927 was supposed to be his year of exceptional success. Weisbord was invited for the second time to Carnegie Hall, to be followed by a tour of performances throughout the United States. However, in the evening of the concert, for unknown reasons, Weisbord refused to go on stage, cancelled his tour and returned to Europe, interrupting his success abruptly. In future years Weisbord continued to perform in Europe, visited Palestine several times and even signed a recording contract. He recorded only 3 works during his life. But his career was never revived. He passed his last years in an apartment in Brooklyn, anonymously, until in 1991, after years of not playing, he died alone. Abram Yampolsky. Abram Yampolsky, born in 1890, was the indirect student of Leopold Auer. He graduated in St. Petersburg in 1913 in the class of Serge Korgiev, a pupil and assistant of Leopold Auer. He went on to become a legendary Soviet violin teacher who nurtured many Soviet virtuosos during his tenure at the Moscow Conservatory. Leonid Kogan was one of his students. Philip Yampolsky. Philip Yampolsky, born in 1874, was also a pupil and assistant of Leopold Auer. He also taught both Leonid Kogan and Abraham Yampolsky. He died in 1957. Emanuel Zetlin. Emanuel Zetlin was a former professor at the University of Washington, who was also one of the first faculty members of the Curtis Institute of Music. He studied with both Karl Flesch and Leopold Auer. Have I forgotten any other of Auer's students? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe to my channel for more videos on the wonderful world of the violin. Leopold Auer was a legendary violin teacher and one of the greatest pedagogues of all time. He churned out many famous violinists, a number of which revered him and emulated his teaching legacy when they themselves later became violin teachers. Auer was himself a student of Jacob Dondt and Joseph Joachim, and also received informal instruction from Henryk Wieniawski. Though Jewish, sometime around 1870, Auer decided to convert to Russian Christian Orthodoxy. His famous class at the conservatory in St. Petersburg is the stuff of legend. Though he produced many world-class students, perhaps his greatest student of all was Jascha Heifetz.